She walked out of her tent in the darkness and never walked back. 3 children, one summer night, and a crime so vicious it would haunt a state for nearly 50 years. This is the story of the Oklahoma Girl Scout case, and this is true. I'm Julian Cross, and tonight we open one of the most disturbing files in American criminal history. Before we begin, I need to ask something of you. This channel, The Midnight File, is built on stories like these. Stories that refuse to fade, that demand to be remembered. We're working toward 100 subscribers, and if you're here because you believe these voices deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. We need you in this community, and later, I'll ask you to do something else. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories reach, because when we remember together, we honor those who can't speak for themselves. Now, if you feel that pull, that need to understand what happened in the woods of Oklahoma in 1977, give this video a like. We're hoping for 20 people willing to say, this matters, because it does. Let's begin. Summer of 1977. America was in a strange place. Post-Watergate cynicism, disco on the radio, Star Wars in theaters. But in northeastern Oklahoma, in Mayes County, there was a different kind of anticipation building. Camp Scott, a Girl Scout camp nestled deep in the rolling, forested hills near Locust Grove, was preparing to open its gates for another season. The camp had been there since 1928, nearly 50 years of laughter, campfires, and childhood memories. It was a place where girls learned independence, made friendships, told ghost stories under canvas roofs. It was supposed to be safe. But something was wrong that spring. In April of 1977, 2 months before the camp's official opening, a counselor arrived early for preparation work. She was one of several staff members getting the cabins and tents ready, sweeping out the off-season dust, checking inventory. When she returned to her belongings one afternoon, she found them disturbed, ransacked. A box of donuts she'd brought had been torn open and emptied, and inside that box, folded carefully, was a note. Handwritten, deliberate. It read, "We are on a mission to accomplish 3 girls in Tent 1. The counselor showed it to the camp director, who examined it, frowned, and ultimately decided it was a prank. Probably kids from town, maybe a disgruntled former employee. The kind of thing that happens at rural camps, local teenagers trying to scare the staff. The note was filed away. The camp continued its preparations. But that wasn't the only incident. In the weeks that followed, staff reported other disturbances, items gone missing, strange sounds in the night, vague sightings of men in the woods surrounding the property. These were dense woods, thick with oak and pine, stretching for miles into the Cookson Hills. The area had always been remote, wild. It wasn't unusual to see hunters or hikers, but there was something different now. A feeling. The kind of unease that settles in your chest and won't leave. The camp director didn't cancel the season. There were hundreds of girls registered. Parents had paid. The staff convinced themselves it was nothing. After all, nothing had ever happened at Camp Scott before. On June 12, 1977, the buses arrived. Over 140 girls, aged 8 to 13, poured out into the sunlight, laughing and shouting, dragging duffel bags and sleeping bags toward their assigned tents. The camp was divided into units, each named after a Native American nation: Cherokee, Comanche, Kiowa. Each unit had several platform tents, large canvas structures on wooden frames, sleeping 6 to 8 girls each. The units were spread out across the property, some closer to the main lodge and counselor quarters, others more isolated. The Kiowa unit was the furthest from the main camp. It sat at the edge of the property, partially hidden behind the shower and bathroom facilities. From the counselors' cabins, you couldn't see it clearly. It was quiet there. Private. The kind of place where you felt alone under the stars. 3 girls were assigned to tent number 7 in the Kiowa unit. Lori Lee Farmer, 8 years old, the youngest of the group, blonde hair, bright smile. She was excited. It was her first time at sleepaway camp. Her parents had driven her from Tulsa, kissed her goodbye, told her to have fun. She waved as they drove away. Michele Heather Guse, 9 years old, also from Tulsa. Michele was energetic, adventurous. She loved the outdoors. Her mother had packed her bag carefully, made sure she had everything she needed. Michele promised to write letters home. Doris Denise Milner, 10 years old, the eldest of the three. From Tulsa as well. Denise was a bit more reserved, thoughtful. She'd been to camp before. She knew the routines, the songs. She was looking forward to another summer of friendship and freedom. 3 girls who didn't know each other before that day. 3 girls assigned to the same tent by pure chance. 3 girls who would never see morning. That first day was full of activity, orientation, games, songs around the campfire. The counselors led the girls through the usual traditions, learning the camp cheer, picking activities for the week ahead. Archery, swimming, arts and crafts. The girls ate dinner together in the mess hall, their voices filling the wooden building with noise and energy. As the sun set, they gathered for the evening program, skits and stories. Then, flashlights in hand, they walked back to their tents. The counselors did their rounds, made sure everyone was settling in. Checked that the younger girls weren't too homesick. By 10:30 the camp was quiet. Canvas flaps tied shut, sleeping bags zipped up, whispered conversations fading into silence. Tent 7 sat in the darkness, surrounded by trees. Sometime around 1:30 in the morning, one of the counselors woke. She heard something, a sound coming from the direction of the Kiowa unit. It was strange, guttural, low, almost like moaning or groaning. She lay there for a moment, listening. Then she grabbed her flashlight and stepped outside. The camp was still. She walked toward the noise, sweeping her beam across the trees, the tents. She saw nothing, no movement, no figures. The sound had stopped. She stood there in the darkness, the weight of the forest pressing in around her. Then she convinced herself it was nothing. An animal, a coyote maybe, or a camper having a bad dream. She went back to her cabin. She went back to sleep. At 6 o'clock in the morning, another counselor woke and began her morning routine. She needed to walk to the showers. As she moved down the trail, still half asleep, she saw something on the path ahead. A sleeping bag. That was odd. Why would someone leave their sleeping bag in the middle of the trail? She walked closer, and then she saw what was inside. A body. A girl. Lifeless. The counselor screamed. Within minutes, other staff members arrived. Chaos. Panic. Someone ran to call the police. Others began searching the area, calling out names, checking tents. And then they found the other 2. About 150 yards from Tent 7, deep in the woods, hidden beneath brush and branches, were the bodies of the other 2 girls. They had been moved, dragged, concealed. All 3 had been attacked with brutal violence. They had been struck in the head, restrained, assaulted. The details are difficult to speak, even now. I will spare you the most graphic descriptions, not because they aren't part of the truth, but because YouTube's policies require me to, and because some horrors don't need to be visualized to be understood. What you need to know is this: these children suffered, and whoever did this to them was methodical, controlled. This wasn't random fury. This was calculated. The camp erupted into trauma. Parents were called, buses were dispatched. By midday, every girl had been taken home. Camp Scott closed its gates. It would never reopen to the Girl Scouts again. The investigation began immediately. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, the OSBI, took the lead, along with local law enforcement. The crime scene was vast and chaotic. Dozens of people had already walked through the area before it could be properly secured. Evidence was everywhere, but contamination was a serious concern. Still, investigators found several critical items. Near the bodies, they discovered a red flashlight. It had been modified, its lens taped over with black plastic, leaving only a small beam of light visible. This is a technique used by people who want to move in the dark without being seen. Burglars use it. So do hunters. So do predators. The tape on the flashlight was masking tape. Investigators later found a roll of similar tape at the camp, but they couldn't definitively prove it was the same roll. Inside the flashlight, they found something else. A piece of newspaper, wedged in to keep the batteries from rattling. It was from the Tulsa World, dated April 1977, the same month the threatening note had been found. Inside Tent 7, investigators found a footprint. It was in the mud just inside the tent flap, a sneaker print, size 9.5. It was stained with blood. There were other items too, a length of cord, a pair of glasses that didn't belong to any of the girls or counselors, fingerprints, hair samples, biological evidence from the assault, and there was another piece of evidence, one that would become critical decades later. A pillowcase, stained, collected and preserved. The question was immediate and unavoidable. Who did this? Law enforcement didn't have to look far. Within hours, a name surfaced. A name that everyone in Mays County knew. A name that had been whispered with fear for years. Gene Leroy Hart. If you're still here, still listening, then you understand what it means to seek truth in the darkest places. If this story grips you, if it makes you feel something, then subscribe to this channel, because there are more files, more voices waiting, and we'll open every single one. Gene Leroy Hart was 33 years old in the summer of 1977. He was a member of the Cherokee Nation, raised in the Locust Grove area. Those who knew him in his youth described him as athletic, charismatic. He'd been a star football player in high school, strong, fast, popular. But there was another side to Gene Hart. In 1966, Hart was convicted of the abduction and assault of 2 pregnant women. The attacks were vicious. He bound them, assaulted them, left them traumatized. He was sentenced to prison, multiple terms running consecutively, over 100 years in total. In 1973, Hart escaped. He and another inmate overpowered a guard and walked out of the Mays County Jail. His accomplice was recaptured quickly. Hart vanished. For 4 years, Gene Leroy Hart lived as a fugitive in the Cookson Hills. These hills are not gentle. They are rugged, dense, carved with ravines and caves. The forest is thick enough to hide in. The terrain is brutal enough to discourage pursuit. Law enforcement knew he was out there. They'd had sightings, tips, rumors, but they couldn't catch him. Hart survived by relying on a network of friends and family in the Cherokee community. Some helped him willingly. Others were too afraid to refuse. He moved between caves and abandoned structures, hunting and foraging. He knew these woods better than anyone. He was a ghost, and Camp Scott sat right in the middle of his territory. When the news of the crime broke, investigators immediately suspected Hart. The brutality matched his history. The location matched his range. The modified flashlight, the stealth, the knowledge of the camp layout. It all pointed to someone who knew the area intimately. But suspicion isn't proof. They needed evidence, and they needed to find him. The manhunt that followed was one of the largest in Oklahoma history. Hundreds of officers, dogs, helicopters. They combed the Cookson Hills, searching caves, interviewing locals, following every lead. The FBI joined the effort. The reward money climbed. Newspapers across the country ran his photo. Gene Leroy Hart stayed hidden. Months passed. Summer turned to fall. Fall turned to winter. The families of Lori, Michele, and Denise waited. The public grew frustrated. How could one man evade an army of law enforcement? On April 6, 1978, 10 months after the crime, agents received a tip. Hart was hiding at the home of a Cherokee elder named Sam Pigeon. Pigeon was a respected figure in the community, a traditional medicine man. His property was remote, surrounded by woods. Officers surrounded the property before dawn. When they moved in, they found Hart inside. He didn't resist. He was arrested, handcuffed, and taken into custody. The trial began in March of 1979. It was held in Pryor, Oklahoma, but the attention was national. The prosecution was confident. They had physical evidence. They had motive. They had opportunity. The prosecutor laid out the case methodically. Hart's criminal history established a pattern of violence against women. His presence in the area made him geographically viable. The items found in one of the caves he'd used included personal belongings stolen from the camp, a pair of sunglasses belonging to a counselor, photographs connected to people Hart knew. Biological evidence recovered from the victims, sperm samples, matched Hart's blood type. This was 1979. DNA analysis as we know it today didn't exist yet. Blood typing was the best they had. And Hart matched. It wasn't definitive, but it was consistent. The prosecution also pointed to Hart's behavior, his extended fugitive status, his survival skills, his familiarity with the area. Who else could have done this? Who else had the means, the history, the proximity? But the defense, led by attorney Garvin Isaacs, was ready, and they were brilliant. Isaacs was one of the best defense attorneys in the state. He understood that in a case like this, you don't just defend your client, you put the investigation itself on trial. The first attack was the footprint. The bloody print found inside tent 7 was a size 9.5. Gene Leroy Hart wore a size 11.5. The prosecution argued he could have worn smaller shoes to disguise his tracks. The defense called this absurd. Try walking through rough terrain in shoes 2 sizes too small. Try committing a violent crime like that. It didn't make sense. The second attack was contamination. The crime scene had been compromised within hours. Dozens of people, counselors, police, parents, reporters, had walked through before it was secured. A palm print found on one of the tent poles was later identified as belonging to an OSPI agent. If professional investigators could contaminate evidence, what else had been compromised? The third attack was the frame-up theory. Isaacs argued that law enforcement, desperate to close the case and calm public panic, had planted evidence. The sunglasses found in Hart's cave could have been placed there, the flashlight, found near the bodies but never definitively linked to Hart. The defense painted a picture of a rush to judgment, a need for a villain. The fourth attack was race. Isaacs carefully, strategically pointed out that Hart was Cherokee, that he was being targeted because he was Native American, because he was an easy scapegoat, that the real perpetrator was still out there, and the state was too focused on Hart to see it. The jury listened. The trial lasted weeks. Witnesses testified. Evidence was examined. The families of the victims sat in the courtroom every day, watching, waiting for justice. On March 30th, 1979, the jury returned. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. The families wept. Hart was acquitted of all charges, but he didn't walk free. Hart was immediately returned to prison to serve the remainder of his original sentence for his prior convictions. He would stay behind bars, just not for the crime at Camp Scott. 3 months later, on June 4, 1979, Gene Leroy Hart collapsed in his cell. Massive heart attack. He was 35 years old. He died almost instantly. Some accepted it as natural causes. A large man, poor health, the stress of the trial. Others whispered darker theories: poisoning, revenge, a family member or supporter who couldn't let him live with the acquittal. To this day, there's no proof either way. Gene Leroy Hart was buried in a Cherokee cemetery. His grave is unmarked, and the case went cold. For decades the file sat. The families never stopped searching for answers. Investigators never stopped wondering. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation held onto the evidence, preserving it, hoping that one day technology would advance enough to give them clarity. In 2008, that day arrived. Sort of. New DNA testing was conducted on evidence from the crime scene, specifically a pillowcase recovered near the bodies. The results were shocking. They found a partial DNA profile, female, and it didn't match any of the victims. Suddenly, the case was open again. Wide open. A female accomplice? A different perpetrator entirely? The defense's frame-up theory seemed validated. If there was DNA from an unknown woman, what did that mean? Theories exploded. Online communities dissected every detail. Some argued Hart had worked with a partner. Others insisted he'd been innocent all along. The families, already traumatized, were thrust back into uncertainty. But DNA is complicated. Partial profiles can come from secondary transfer. A factory worker who handled the pillowcase before it was sold, another camper who touched it, contamination during the investigation. The presence of unknown DNA doesn't automatically mean involvement in the crime. Still, it was enough to keep doubt alive. In 2019, Mays County Sheriff Mike Reed decided to try again. He reached out to the OSBI and requested a comprehensive DNA review using the latest technology. The evidence was re-examined, every sample, every swab, every stained fabric. The testing took years. In May of 2022, Sheriff Reed held a press conference. He stood behind a podium surrounded by officials and delivered the results. The DNA evidence, though degraded, had been analyzed as thoroughly as modern science allowed. Every other person of interest had been excluded. Every alternative theory had been tested and found lacking. The conclusion, Reed said, was clear. While the DNA wasn't complete enough to secure a conviction in court, it strongly suggests that Gene Leroy Hart was the perpetrator. Reed's exact words were, "Unless something new comes up, something that we don't know about, I am convinced that Hart is the one that did it." For the families, it was both relief and devastation. Relief because finally, after 45 years, there was an answer. Devastation because the man responsible had died decades ago, never held accountable in a court of law. The case remains technically open. No conviction means no closure, legally speaking. But in the eyes of law enforcement, the mystery is solved. Gene Leroy Hart took 3 children into the darkness, and he got away with it. Not because he was smarter, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because the system, imperfect, human, flawed, couldn't hold him to account in time. If this story has reached into your chest and refuses to let go, then do me a favor. Share it. Send this video to someone who cares about justice, about memory, about the stories that shape us. Because the more people who hear these names, Laurie, Michele, Denise, the less likely they are to be forgotten. Camp Scott still stands. Sort of. The property was sold to a private owner not long after the tragedy. The tents are gone, the cabins are rotting, the trails are overgrown. But if you drive down the old dirt roads near Locust Grove, you can still find the remains. The shower building crumbling, the mess hall collapsed, the platform where Tent 7 once stood, empty. It's a ghost place now, a scar in the woods. The families of the 3 girls became advocates. They pushed for stronger background checks at youth camps. They fought for better security protocols. They testified before legislators. They made sure that what happened at Camp Scott would never be ignored, never be minimized. Laurie Farmer's parents carried her memory with grace and pain. They spoke publicly, kept her story alive. Laurie would have been 55 years old today. She never got to grow up, never got to fall in love, have a family, find her purpose. Michele Guse's mother became a fierce voice for victims' rights. She refused to let the case fade. Even in her final years, she demanded answers. Michele would have been 54. She loved the outdoors. She loved adventure. She should have had a lifetime of both. Denise Milner's family carried the weight quietly. Denise was the oldest of the 3. She'd been to camp before. She should have been safe. She would have been 57 now. We'll never know what she might have become. 3 girls, 3 futures erased. 1 night, 1 monster. There are people who still argue Gene Leroy Hart was innocent. They point to the acquittal. They point to the unknown DNA. They believe the system worked, that reasonable doubt existed, that maybe someone else was responsible. I understand that impulse, I do. We want to believe the system is fair, that juries get it right, that justice is blind. But I also know this. Gene Leroy Hart was a violent man with a history of brutalizing women. He lived in the woods surrounding Camp Scott. He had the means, the motive, the opportunity. Evidence from his hideout connected him to the camp. Biological evidence matched his profile. And 45 years later, DNA testing ruled out every other suspect. Sometimes the simplest answer is the right one. Sometimes a monster is just a monster. And sometimes he dies before justice can be served. There's a lesson in this story, though it's not a comforting one. The lesson is that evil doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear a sign. It doesn't come with a soundtrack or a warning. Evil walks into a summer camp on a warm June night. It listens to children's laughter. It waits until they're asleep. And it acts. The world didn't end that night. The sun rose the next morning. Birds sang. The rest of the campers went home to their families. Life continued. But for 3 families, the world stopped, and it has never started again. Before I close this file, I want to leave you with something. A thought, a question maybe. How many other Gene Leroy Harts are out there? How many people living in the margins, in the woods, in the shadows, watching and waiting? How many warnings do we ignore because we don't want to believe something terrible could happen? The note found in April said, We are on a mission to accomplish 3 girls in tent 1. It was dismissed. The sounds heard in the night were attributed to animals. The sightings of men in the woods were explained away. We are so desperate to believe we're safe that we ignore the signs. I'm not saying we should live in fear. I'm saying we should live with eyes open. We should listen when something feels wrong. We should trust our instincts. We should protect the vulnerable. Because sometimes the monsters are real. Laurie Farmer, Michele Guse, Denise Milner. Say their names, remember them. Not as victims, though they were, but as children who deserve to grow old, who deserve to become who they were meant to be. This case is closed, as much as any case without a conviction can be closed. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation has said their piece. The sheriff has made his determination. The families have found what closure they can, but the tent still stands in memory. The darkness still holds secrets. And somewhere, in the woods of eastern Oklahoma, the wind moves through the trees where 3 girls once whispered and laughed. If you've stayed with me this long through this entire story, then you're part of something important. You're part of keeping these stories alive, so do me one more favor. Subscribe to the Midnight File, be part of this community, because there are more stories, more names, more files that need to be opened. And if you haven't yet, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what this story meant to you. Tell me if you remember when this happened, or if you're hearing it for the first time. We remember together. That's how we honor the dead. Thank you for walking through this darkness with me. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. This is Julian Cross, and this file is closed, but the night is never over until next time. Stay vigilant.